The conflict between Israel and Gaza is rooted in historical grievances, territorial disputes, and political ideologies. The establishment of Israel in 1948 led to the displacement of Palestinians and the First Arab-Israeli War. Subsequent wars in 1956, 1967, and 1973 entrenched divisions and fueled resentment. The 1967 war resulted in Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, territories Palestinians aspire to for a future state. The occupation of Gaza, home to a predominantly Palestinian population, has been a major point of contention. Over the years, Palestinians in Gaza have faced severe restrictions on movement, resources, and economic opportunities. The rise of Hamas in the early 2000s further complicated the situation, with armed resistance and rocket attacks against Israel. Israel argues its actions are necessary to protect its citizens from terrorism, implementing security measures that have exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The latest escalation in violence is a stark reminder of the fragile peace in the region. Clashes between Israeli police and Palestinian protesters at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem sparked the violence. Following the initial clashes, Hamas fired rockets from Gaza into Israel, prompting retaliatory airstrikes. The exchange of fire quickly escalated, with both sides launching increasingly deadly attacks. Israel targeted Hamas military infrastructure, while Hamas continued to fire rockets into major Israeli cities. The rocket attacks have killed and injured Israeli civilians, spreading fear and disruption. The violence has also spilled over into the West Bank, resulting in further casualties. The escalating violence has drawn widespread international condemnation. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned that the conflict could spiral into an uncontainable crisis. Guterres called for an immediate ceasefire and emphasized the need to protect civilians. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting but failed to agree on a joint statement. The US has reiterated its support for Israel's right to defend itself, while expressing concern for Palestinian civilian casualties. The EU and other world leaders have called for an end to the violence and a return to dialogue. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is rapidly deteriorating. Hospitals are overwhelmed with the injured, struggling with limited medical supplies and staff. Continuous airstrikes have caused widespread damage to homes, businesses, and essential infrastructure. The blockade imposed by Israel has severely limited the movement of people and goods, exacerbating the crisis. The UN has warned that the blockade has created a dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, with high rates of poverty, unemployment, and food insecurity. Many Palestinians are seeking refuge in UN-run schools, which are struggling to cope with the influx of displaced families. The international community has responded with diplomacy and humanitarian aid. The US has pledged millions in humanitarian assistance for Palestinians while backing Israel's right to defend itself. The EU has announced emergency funding and called for the immediate delivery of humanitarian aid. The ICRC has stepped up operations in Gaza, providing medical supplies and essential items. The UN has ramped up its humanitarian response, providing shelter, food, and other assistance to displaced Palestinians. Increased funding is needed to meet the growing humanitarian needs in Gaza. The path forward remains uncertain as violence continues. The international community calls for a ceasefire, but a lasting solution seems elusive. The underlying issues, land disputes, security concerns, and Palestinian statehood, remain unresolved. Experts believe any sustainable solution must address these root causes and involve meaningful negotiations. The two-state solution has long been seen as the most viable option, but prospects have dimmed in recent years. Some argue a one-state solution may be the only way forward, but it faces significant challenges. The immediate priority is to end the violence and alleviate the suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire.